Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Deliverance Project. I am your host, Anthony. If you have stumbled upon this podcast, we are right in the middle of Season 4 and Season 5. And so we would hope that you would stick around and possibly go back and listen to some of the previous episodes to see what we're about. But we never leave you without content. So what we are going to be doing is giving you some bonus content, some previously behind the paywall bonus content that comes from our Patreon campaign, which is patreon.com/The Deliverance Project. And there is a free 7-day trial on there. So if this content sparks your interest, it seems like something you might be willing to pursue, please check it out there and see if you like it. For the next 2 weeks up through the 21st of May, we are going to be, like I said, taking a little break, doing some fun stuff, but we are also going to be preparing for Season 5, which we're going to put a whole lot of effort into to bring you a lot more of the content you've been asking for. And so if you'll bear with us and come back with us on the 21st, so please stick around tonight and check out this bonus content. We'll see you soon. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Deliverance Project podcast. I'm your host, Anthony, and tonight's bonus episode is one that we've had a lot of requests to talk about, and I think it's because it's one of those obscure topics that even Christians who believe in this kind of paranormal, demonic type spiritual warfare realm don't really know where to place these entities. So tonight we are going to take some time and learn about the black-eyed children. Before we get to the episode, I just want to remind you of a couple things going on with the Struggle Series LLC. That is our company that kind of governs all of our both podcasts, the books, everything that's going on with us as an entity. And right now, the big thing we're working on is the new book entitled The Return. This is the third book in the Struggle series, and it's one that I feel is probably the best work yet. And I think the only reason for that is when you start writing books and you're not an author, you kind of figure things out along the way. And I think by the third book, maybe I had a little better handle on what it is to put a story together. So we've had some great feedback so far, and we're just in the beginning stages. So there'll be a whole lot more marketing and things coming out. But the book is available for purchase, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy your books. If you do buy it through the website, which is thestruggleseries.com, the price would be the same, but we will do a personalized message. I'll sign it for you, whatever it is you'd like me to do. And there's a spot on there when you order it to leave us a note and get that to us on that site if that's what you prefer. If not, we don't care where you buy it from. Just purchase it if you're somebody who's into kind of the Christian paranormal realm. This book is written from the perspective of a Christian deliverance minister, even though it's a horror type novel, detective kind of criminal thriller type novel. It's written from the Christian perspective, whereas most of these books are written from more of a Catholic kind of a priest coming in to resolve the demonic attack. So it's something different, something unique, and definitely something that we feel you would enjoy if you're somebody who's a fan of the paranormal or thrillers or detective novels, or even want to hear the gospel message. It's all in there. So check that out if you can. Also want to remind you to check out our other podcast entitled The Struggle Series. And that's can be found on the same places you find this podcast. And we just simply narrate the books on that podcast, including book 3 in its entirety. It is there for you to listen to if that's something you're interested. And we also weave in some scary stories in between some of the chapters there, because we are actually on Saga 4 in the Struggle series entitled The Cabal. So, enough of that. What we want to do tonight is, like I said, break down this concept of the black eyed children, or also known as the black eyed kids. Now, if you are not familiar with this phenomenon, I would say it's about one of the single most terrifying phenomenon that exists out there. If you fully understand kind of the concept of this and take it beyond just the storytelling and put yourself in a situation where this actually occurred to you. And I say that because a lot of people who are into the paranormal can sit on a couch or lay in bed at night and watch a horror movie or a paranormal, ghost hunting show or a documentary even about a paranormal phenomenon. And it's very easy to say, well, if I was there, I would have done this or that. And maybe you would, but I think most people, if they were honest, would have a different reaction than if they actually, different reaction than they would on the couch if they were actually there. So this is one of those concepts where you would want to say, let me put myself in the shoes of the people and not just hear the story for what it's worth. And so if you are unfamiliar with this phenomenon, let me break it down just a little bit. So there is a phenomenon where people will be somewhere and they are approached. They're either in their house or in their car, in their place of business, even out at a restaurant, walking back to their car, whatever it may be. And young children, approximately maybe 5 to 17 years of age, usually in groups of two or more, and they will come, like I said, to wherever you are, and they will ask you for a ride or to come in and use the phone. They will have sort of a backstory, like, we're lost. Our parents are probably worried about us. Um, can we come in and use your phone? It's cold outside. My brother is scared, and there'll be like maybe a 12-year-old and then a 5-year-old. And of course, that would play on your emotions, right? Because if you saw these little children that are out in the dark or in the rain, you would have an instinct to say, of course, I will help you. But people who report this phenomenon um, state that there's just some feeling that they get that doesn't quite line up with the fact that these are children. So there's some sort of fear that starts welling up inside of you. But the kids will continue to insist, saying, "It won't take long. I just want to come in and use the phone," or "If you could give us a ride." But they start to say weird things that allude to the fact that they are, I guess, requiring permission to enter. So they can't just get in. Now, most of the people that have had these interactions state that the speech or the children, when they're speaking, kind of tend to speak in an old time language. So it doesn't quite line up with how kids would speak. And so they, like in one instance, for example, the children said, "Can we come in and use your telegraph?" Well, nobody has a telegraph that would be telling a story like this. So kind of doesn't make sense. A kid would know what a telephone is and definitely wouldn't know what a telegraph is. I'm 53 and I've never seen a telegraph, but somebody my age has heard of these things, but kids wouldn't know what that was. And they also tend to have like weird type of clothing that doesn't quite line up with the times, like really baggy kind of old time clothes. Or if they do have new time clothes, it's more like a hoodie pulled over their heads, some sort of hood, but it doesn't, they don't fit well. And so they will continue to ask for permission. But by this time, most people will have a fear or a terror that is so indescribable that they usually just shut the door or not let them in the car or whatever, wherever they are. And what they will do is kind of drive away and or look out the window and the kids are gone. And so there's a phenomenon that's developed here. Now, people don't really know where to um, kind of trace these origins to. There is a story back from the 1950s of a boy named Harold, and Harold tells a story, and this is well before they would have called this a black-eyed children story. But he said he was 16 years old and he lived in a town where kind of everybody knew everybody, a town in Virginia, smaller town, you know everybody in the town. And as he's walking by, he sees a boy that he's never seen before. So in this type of town, you stop and say, "Hey, how are you? Where are you from? Do you need some help?" type thing. And the boy, basically in a weird kind of regimented monotone voice, said, "I have to go home with you. You have to take me to your house." And so Harold, is like freaked out instantly. So this is why they think this might be the first kind of documented, maybe, story of this, because he senses this dread. And so as this boy's saying, "I have to go home with you," he tries to kind of find his way out of the conversation. And in his mind, he says, "I'm going to run." But as he's thinking this, the black-eyed child, or or this young boy, says, "Don't you dare try to run from me." Not almost as if to sense what he was doing or reading his mind. I don't really believe in that, but he definitely felt that he was going to run. So Harold just did what hopefully most of us would do, is he took off running anyway. And he did escape. He goes into the house and tells his parents. And of course, they thought, is this real or not? But they did tell the story because they wanted other people to know if there's this weird, creepy boy that's trying to go to people's homes, but they never found him. And so that's where they can trace this back now. Once other stories later, towards the future, in the 1990s, which is the story I'm going to read in a second, people start researching, has this ever happened before? And that's where they stumbled upon a newspaper article where Harold told his story, if that makes sense. So the basic beginnings or of this story becoming more mainstream, like I said, happened in 1996. And this story can be found if you do any research of your own. It would be known as the Tale of Brian Bethel. And so the story goes like this. Brian is a journalist. He kind of works for as a reporter. And he gets busy, and all of a sudden he realizes that he hasn't paid one of his utilities. And back in the 90s, I don't, most people don't realize this, but they used to have like drop boxes at the utility place. And you can actually write a check and go drop it in the Dropbox, and it would post the next day. Those of us who've had to, pay our bills last minute so they didn't shut something off would definitely know what that's about. And as he's sitting in his car writing the check that he wants to go put in the Dropbox, um, this is in Abilene, Texas, by the way. So he's sitting in this big open parking lot. So just imagine it's like a strip mall. There's a movie theater, there's different stores, and there's not a lot of cars because it's pretty late at night. And so he's parked with nothing around him, maybe, 50, 60 feet from the building. And as he's writing this check, he says that he had that feeling where your hair stands on end. And as somebody who has a gift of discernment, I think I've taught this to a lot of people, but I think it would make sense to everybody, is that feeling is very primal. I believe it's very spiritual as well. But when we get that feeling, we know that there is danger. It's not like we have to see what is causing this, because it's not seen through our eyes or through our normal senses. There is no convincing us otherwise that there's something to fear. And so when you get that, when you're writing a check and out of nowhere that comes, that is something to pay attention to. And so his hair stands on end. Of course, what do you do? So he looks up and he sees these two boys wearing hoodies. And so it sort of disarms him, but at the same token, he continues to kind of get that weird feeling. So he kind of assumes they're going to ask for money. So he just rolls down the window a crack, getting ready to kind of tell them to go away. But the older boy, which he says was in between like the ages of 12 and 14, says that they needed a ride home because they forgot their money and they wanted to go see a movie, and so they needed to go home and get some money from their mom. Now when you think about like, what you would do, it would be it kind of makes sense, but he also said in his head like, wait a minute, like it's late. What movies start late? And those of us who are movie fans know that your last movie's maybe going to start at 9:50, 10 o'clock. So this is later than that. So he asks them, "What movie are you gonna go see?" And the reason he does that is he looks up at the kind of the marquee, the sign, and he sees that the movie that they listed has already been playing for about 45 minutes. And so this is when he kind of senses that something's wrong. So the kids start to kind of sense that he's kind of not bought their story. So they start to say, the older boy starts to say creepy things. And seems to be a common theme with these black eyed children, is he says, "Hey, we're just kids. We're not going to hurt you, but you have to let us in your car and give us a ride. We can't get in unless you tell us it's okay. We just need a ride. It won't take that long. We don't have a gun or anything." Now, when Brian hears this, he's, I'm done. There's something wrong. So he just decides to do what hopefully all of us would do, and he says, "I'm out of here." So he just slams the car in gear and takes off. Now, again, he's in the parking lot, kind of not around anybody or anything. So he peels out, whips around, and then as he whips around, there is nobody there. And this only took a second or so. There was nowhere for those kids to go that he wouldn't have seen which direction they ran. So it's like they disappeared into thin air. Now, if you think about what would you do in that situation? Well, Brian, as he thought about it, the more he thought about it, the thing that stuck out to him the most, that gave him the creeps, which I kind of left for the end, is when he saw their eyes when they were talking to him, they were all black. No pupil, no, I mean, the pupil and the sclera, no whites of your eyes, all black. And so he goes and tells his friend, and his friend happens to be kind of, I think he calls him on the phone, and the friend has somebody there, and there who kind of maybe knows about this stuff. And so as he's telling the story to his friend, the friend is sharing it, and a lady that was there said, "I've had a dream about these things. It's a good thing he didn't let them in, because that would have been the end of him." So that story kind of circulated. And of course, he's a journalist. So as he submitted it, it had some traction. But of course, people, could say, well, he's a journalist and he knows how to get stories published. This is something he made up. But of course, people start to do research, and that's where people found the story of Harold. But of course, other people start to come through with stories of their own. So this phenomenon, is seems to be older than people think. So if you're somebody who can do a lot of research, you will find very quickly that there are ancient cultures. There's one in particular you'd find pretty easy, where there's a statue that has all black eyes, like made out of like onyx. And so they say these beings may have existed for a very long time, but that could be a stretch type thing. But what you want to do is start looking at the phenomenon as a whole. And Brian's story seemed to kind of open up for other people to tell their stories. And then subsequently, many people have told these stories. So, one of the stories that caught my attention when I started doing research on this several years ago is one that kind of addresses the question that has always been everybody's fear. And that is, um, what would happen if these things got in? And that's what kind of we really want to work on, right? Because if these things are asking for permission to get in, the next logical conclusion is what would happen if they did get in? And so this story addresses that, and the next one I'm going to read kind of addresses that as well. But there's always been the rumor that if they get in, that you're going to disappear, you're going to be killed, your life's going to be ended. And we here at the Deliverance Project have always said that who knows how many disappearances, kind of unsolved weird murders, occurred where people don't really know what happened. Who knows how many of those are paranormal related? And because detectives can't find evidence or clues, they just call it an unsolved kind of crime. But if you really broke down like the evidence that they do have, maybe a detective is not willing to say this is beyond human. This is paranormal, but I'm just going to call it unsolved because I'm not going to ruin my career by saying some demon did this or something. But this story here is one you can do your research on this story as well. You'd find it pretty easily because it's well known. But the story goes like this: in this snowy town within the middle of nowhere, Vermont, this elderly couple hears a sound like three loud knocks on a door. Now, paranormal people right away, that three knocks is known to symbolize, a mocking of the Trinity, something demonic. But they hear three knocks. They open the door and they see two kids, a boy and a girl, fairly young, and they're talking really weird, and they're saying like again, their speech is kind of odd, and they're saying parents will be here soon, may we come in. Now, they don't say, hi ma'am, we're sorry to bother you, we're kind of stuck out here, my parents were supposed to meet us, but it's snowing, can we come in and wait for our parents? It's parents will be here soon, may we come in. That odd kind of speech pattern. Now, the children don't make eye contact and they just stand in the doorway. Um, so they, the older woman, who is very different, the thinking of an older person is very different than people today. They're more trusting because they didn't have all this weird stuff that happens, not just paranormally, but criminally in the world where you can't really trust people anymore. But, she did say that the kids didn't make contact. They just kind of looked at the ground and, didn't, say much more than that. But she was hesitant. But after a while, she did what an older person would do. Two kids in the snow, I better let them in. So she goes on to say that the kids sit on the couch and she goes to make them some hot cocoa. And the husband starts asking them questions, but they're not answering. And so when the wife returned back from, bringing in the cocoa, she noticed that the cat was scared and angry. And she says that the cat loved everybody or would stay away, but it wasn't, skittish or whatever. And then the kids kind of in unison say, may we use the restroom? And when she looked at the kids as they looked up at her to ask for the restroom, that's when she finally saw that their eyes were black. And I think the term she used was like a starless universe. So she says, did you see their eyes? But the husband can't pay attention because he's literally holding his mouth over his nose with an enormous amount of blood gushing out. So as this is happening, the power suddenly goes out in the entire house. So it's dark in the house. So can you imagine the terror? She sees their black eyes. She sends them to the restroom. Her husband's nose bleeding. The power goes out. Now, the wife headed to the restroom, and just like any good horror movie, she was confronted by the voice of the kids at the end of the hall. So she can kind of see their shadows at the end of the hall, but can hear them saying, our parents are here. The kids then bolted, ran for the door, and ran outside, leaving the door wide open. The wife looked out the door and noticed that there were two really kind of absurdly skinny men at the end of the driveway. They were very tall and very, very slender, very like unnaturally skinny. And the wife waved at them, but uh, kind of like friendly, like, hey, but the two men just turned and left, got in a car and drove away. So, right of course, on cue, the power comes back on. And throughout the next week, weird things began to happen in the house. Three of the four cats went missing, and the fourth was found dead in a pool of blood out of nowhere. The husband continued to have nosebleeds, and when he finally went to the doctor, he was diagnosed with a very aggressive skin cancer. So this story, gives an idea of what could happen if these kids were let in. Now, speculation, of course, was always that you could die immediately if they come in. But is it possible that these kids, that the mysterious illness showed up because of the kids and obviously the pets being killed, especially one in a pool of its own blood? And when, these people love cats, they're not going to kill the cat themselves. And it didn't just die like of some mysterious thing, it was bleeding out like the husband, just mysterious bleeding out. So, uh, there's stories that, kind of send a chill down your spine. That would be one of them, because paranormal activity, a mysterious illness, and then eventually the death of not only a cat, but of the woman's husband. Now, kind of in a similar fashion, I want to tell this next story because this one is also one that you could find if you do some research because it's similar. So, a woman takes her young son with her, and she decides to go into the little convenience store, mini mart store. And, for those of us who are a little bit older, our parents would go to the store and leave us in the car all the time. Definitely not supposed to do that anymore. But in, certain small towns or whatever, people still don't have a fear of doing that. And this wasn't an infant, this was a younger boy. And her son was in the back seat, kind of belted in to like a booster seat type thing. And he told her he would wait in the car. And they often did this together, so she kind of said, okay, as long as you feel, like a big boy, whatever the case may be. So he stayed in the car. Well, she was in there for less than 5 minutes. And when she came out, another kid was sitting in the back seat with him, sitting right next to him, kind of in the middle. So he's on the passenger side. She comes walking in, looks through the windshield, and sees a little boy sitting right in the middle, right next to him. And she had, again, that immediate terror reaction, not a reaction of who's this stranger in my car, because it's a kid. So it should be like the normal reaction would be, who's this kid that's in my car? Versus if it's an adult, you would have that sort of terror. But she sensed a terror that didn't make sense for it just being a kid sitting in the car. They said in the story, it says she dropped the milk, opened the back door to get her son out of the car. And that's when she saw the jet black eyes of the child that was sitting next to her son. She said it was a look of pure evil. So she grabs her son, runs back in the store, and tells the clerk to call 911. And she called her husband. And the story goes that the clerk went and locked the door because he had heard of some sort of thing like this before. Now, I don't know if that was at that store specifically or if he maybe had just heard the phenomenon. And so she calls her husband. And of course, when they went back out, the children were nowhere to be found. A police report was made, but no child of that description was ever located or even seen by the police. So, you can kind of imagine the police are like, okay, so you're calling us because a little kid got in your car and he had all black eyes, so the cops would either think this lady's Looney Tunes or the kid, might be playing a prank and he has, contacts in or whatever. And by the way, if you do some research on this, there are some little kind of devices, like contact devices that you could put in your eyes. And people, they say some people might be pranking people by, you know, making their eyes all black so they can be the black-eyed children, which some of these cases may actually be that, but definitely that came from the original stories. They didn't invent these devices and then the stories started happening. So long story short, the police can't do nothing, but her husband drives up And she says, I'm taking your car and you're going to drive my car home. But before that, they asked the kid what happened. So the cops and the parents, I probably should throw this part in there. And she said the kid came up to the car window and said, I want in. So he opened the door. And and maybe, if it's a kid, I'll have somebody to play with. And so he let the kid come in the car. And he basically told his mom and dad that the child climbed over him and sat next to him. And this is when his mom came out. So he opened his door. The kid climbed over the top of him and sat next to him in the car. So again, the mother was fearful, said, You drive this car, I'm going to drive your car home. Well, guess what? On the way home, the husband was in a wreck that totaled the SUV. Um, that's creepy. I mean, coincidence, of course, skeptics will say, well, that's just coincidence. The husband was scared. He wasn't paying attention, blah, 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 blah. The next day, however, the son became sick and for the next 8 months continued with an unexplained illness whose symptoms seemed to change every time he went to the doctor. So he'd go to the doctor with symptoms, they'd try to work on it, then he'd get other symptoms. So for 8 months, a normally healthy kid is fighting off this illness. So finally, the parents went to their local church and asked them to come and pray for their son. And they did this for weeks. And as a result of the prayer, the son was healed from whatever the illness was. And all the fear kind of subsided because, of course, the family was, in their beliefs that this was some sort of demonic thing. Now, let me say this before I kind of take us to, some brief little excerpts here. I believe wholeheartedly that this is demonic, but some of the other kind of things that it could be, people say they could be vampires because, in vampire lore, they cannot come in unless you let them in. Definitely aliens. People say that these could be alien type beings. As maybe who the men in black are. So the tall, skinny men that were at the end of the driveway could have been men in black. And all of these things are viable, right? Because we're just talking about a phenomenon where there's been no actual mugshots of kids with black eyes that were arrested for harassing people, right? So it's all speculation, it's all conjecture at this point, but very similar things would occur with a demon, right? And we speak here a lot on the Deliverance Project about, demons requiring different levels of permission to get in. And definitely, in some cases, could they just be so bold to say, I need permission to get in your car. I need permission to get in your house. I need you to let me in. And of course, manipulation and deception is what demons are good at. So, have they found just one of their many avenues to use innocent children to get into people's houses? And I would say that's very likely because, we hear stories like the Sally house and different paranormal stories where they thought the ghost in their house was a child, and some people had seen this apparition of a child. And so the family is disarmed and actually welcomes the child to stay in the house. And then at the end of the story, it turns out it was a demon. Or some people can't even still come to grips with that and say there's a child, but then there was also a demon, and not realizing that it was all the same entity, using deception and manipulation. But I'll tell you another story, just briefly, kind of paraphrase as I've done with these other ones. You can do your own research and find the actual, narration of these stories. And I definitely, don't want to steal somebody's, copyrighted information. So I'm just paraphrasing. But there, you do a search of black eyed children on, YouTube or whatever, you'll find a million stories. But this story always stuck out to me too, because this was by a military guy. He used to have family on the complete opposite side of Texas, and if you've ever driven through Texas, it is big. And so it could take you a very long time to drive from East Texas to West Texas or vice versa. And so he's got family there, but he said he actually loved to just drive kind of late at night, just drive through, kind of peaceful, listen to the radio type of thing. And he's driving out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, a lot of roads where there's not a lot of towns. You'll get to certain sections. So, you got to use the restroom. You don't, you're miles and miles away from a gas station, so you just do what men do, just pull over and take a leak outside of the truck. Well, he says as he's doing this, he comes back around the front of the truck, and there's a child standing there, like a younger teenage boy type child, and says, uh, "You need to let me in your truck. You need to give me a ride. It won't take that long. You need to give me a ride." Same creepy speech pattern, same kind of weird clothing, and this guy's a military guy, like a soldier, not, didn't get into the military and do the light work. He was a combat guy. And so he said, admittedly, there was a terror that came over me. It wasn't natural for a kid. It's one thing to say, "Hey, kid, I can't give you a ride. I don't know who you are," but it was like, why am I so afraid of this kid? So the interaction kind of concluded with him getting a look at the boy's eyes, which were completely black. So he jumps in his truck and takes off. But he's a man's man, so he doesn't get far up the road and says, "What are you doing? You're a combat vet. Like, this is a little kid. What's this little kid gonna do? What if that kid really needs help?" So he flips the truck around. He hadn't gone very far. He came, nothing there. Goes up into the trees, looks around, got a flashlight. He's looking for lights, maybe of a house that's sitting kind of far back off the road. There's nothing. This kid is gone. And so when you hear stories like that, you say to yourself, okay, what would happen if this kid was in the car? Because much like the kid in the house, the kids in the house of the elderly couple, they eventually took off, but they caused a lot of havoc. But our imaginations could run wild and say, would he have been killed? Is that what happens when they find people like dead on the side of the road? Would it have looked like a heart attack? We don't know, but that's part of the fear. But as somebody who has seen, kind of the backside of demonic schemes, I could tell you that it is not astonishing that this is probably easily described as demonic sort of attack. And what I mean by behind the scenes is, you know, many people have watched horror movies, they've seen, different listen to podcasts or seen paranormal shows where people explain some sort of demonic oppression, infestation, possession, whatever stage you want to look at. But even in those shows or programs, they don't really dig into kind of the history, how these things work. Maybe The Exorcist, is a good example of where they kind of try to do a backstory. But even the movie doesn't, because the movie is a kind of a adaptation of the original story. So, for example, the original story was not a girl named Reagan; it was a boy, and he had a aunt who was a spiritualist, and she taught him how to use a Ouija board. And when she died, he tried to summon her, and that's where they believe the demon came. So you can kind of see a history by digging into the story. But as a minister who's gone to people's homes and had people come to see him at the church and different, many different venues and avenues, a lot of deliverance ministry now is done at services, sort of like altar calls. But there are a whole lot of stories where deliverance ministers will go to people's homes or bring them to the church, and you do get a thorough history of kind of how these things transpired. And sometimes you even have to dig it out of people. But when you hear stories, you hear kind of like, well, I was at a bad place in my life. I was sad, I was depressed, I was angry, I had a lot of unforgiveness. I started to kind of curse God. I started to kind of seek other spirituality. I met this person, and the story will progress from there. And so I've always thought that if I ever investigated a black eyed child story, not that I do that, and nor would I, but if I ever had the opportunity, if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, I think I want to come to you and talk to you about this because we had this black-eyed child encounter," my thing would be to figure out what's going on in these people's lives. Now, when I say things like that, a lot of people say, well, like you're kind of accusing people or you're kind of, insinuating that something's going on. Well, that's the most logical place to start. I'm not saying that, a lot of times those were overt behaviors that somebody was doing. A lot of times people don't realize what they're opening themselves up to with their thoughts and their feelings and their emotions and their behaviors that might seem more subtle. So it's not an accusation, it's helping you diagnose where this happened. One of the big ones we talk about a lot is unforgiveness. And unforgiveness is very, very, very difficult subject because people who are struggling to forgive somebody, the last thing they need is a minister or anybody saying, well, you just got to get over it and forgive, which is not what people are saying, but that's what it will sound like. So if somebody harmed you in some brutal, sort of violent way, that could take years and decades to find forgiveness. That's human. No, nobody would fault you for that. But if that unforgiveness can fester, it actually opens a door to the demonic to make you question God, to make you seek vengeance, to make you kind of not heal. And, you think of what kind of conversation a person must have with somebody to say, hey, you have a right to feel the way you feel, but it is also causing you problems. I mean, that could take a therapist a dozen sessions to be able to allow that person to kind of work through stuff to come to a conclusion that although their unforgiveness may be justified, it is also detrimental. You can't just pop in on the first session and go, well, I don't blame you for being upset about this, but if you don't forgive, a demon's going to come and possess you, or you're going to continue to be negative, or you're going to continue to have a bad life. You can't do that because that person has a right to their feelings. So it's a very complicated subject, which is why a demon can use that. Depression, anxiety, these things are not overt behaviors that you're doing, but they are doors to the demonic. And that's what I think where people should look at in terms of a black eyed child encounter. So let's say you listen to this and 6 weeks from now, you're sitting in your house and you hear a knock on your front door, and, there's some black eyed children that are asking to come in. Or even worse, some of the stories I've heard, I'll give you an example. There's a story of a police officer that went out to a call. And as he was finishing the call and was sitting in his car doing paperwork, he looked up and saw these children kind of on the patio of a house. So, like on the backside of the house where there was no staircase. And these children are standing on there knocking on the back door. So the cop is like, hey, what are you kids doing? So he's looking up at them from like the street level. What are you kids doing? And they said, these people won't let us in. So as he goes to investigate, the kids go off the balcony, which there was no way for them to do without hurting themselves. He goes to ask the family. They were like, we didn't hear anything. And so this is a police officer reporting this in a report. What benefit would he have to tell a story like that? I mean, most cops would have just said, well, I'm going to go back to my original report from that other call and I'm going to say nothing. But it disturbed him so much that he spoke out about this. My question would be, what was going on with those people in that house that these demons decided that they were going to take a shot? Now, we don't know about these people. I'm not even sure they were ever named in the report, or at least that was ever released. It was just more about the cop's story than it was about the family. But that's what I would worry about. And that's where I would guide people and say, okay, check this out. You've had this encounter. Let's try to break down why at this moment in your life would demons attack. And if the answer is simply you're doing so well in life that the demons are got to try to disrupt it or break it up, well, at least you kind of did some homework and did that. Got to that conclusion. What I mean by did that. You got to that conclusion by doing the homework. But what you don't want to do is say, well, I don't think there's really anything going on. So that has nothing to do with me. These things just showed up. Because in most cases, I would say in most cases, they saw you as vulnerable in this moment. And that's a door you have to close because they've already walked through that door and now they're literally knocking on your door. So when you go back to the Brian Bethel story, sitting in the parking lot, was he having financial problems? That's why he was paying his bill late. Was he too busy and he had the money, but his life was so chaotic and so busy that he forgot to pay his bills, that he had to go get out in the middle of the night, go get in the car and go pay this bill? You could quickly find out that maybe there was a lot going on. Could it have been that in his investigative journeys, Brian stumbled upon something that was going to expose something, and the demons behind that scheme came for him to distract him? You can go down many rabbit holes just with by thinking about it for 10 seconds, let alone if you sat with that person and investigated it. Now, to conclude, let's just say this. This is not a huge phenomenon. There's definitely a zillion times more people that say they've seen a ghost or an apparition that have seen a black-eyed child. There's in comparison, it's not even close. There's not very many black-eyed children encounters reported or otherwise. But we have to sit there and say, when paranormal activity comes your way, what I like about the story I told about the kid in the car, and the parents of eventually realizing that this is a spiritual problem, they go to the church, they get some prayer, and then this thing goes away, including the health problems. So the miraculous part of this is not just that they stopped feeling the fear of the black-eyed child attack, but their child was actually healed from an unknown or several unknown illnesses. That's miraculous. That's where we always go with paranormal. So whether you call us with, there's a ghost in my house, there's a demon in my house, there's a black-eyed child that rang the doorbell, there's a entity that's looking in my windows at night, as in a couple episodes ago, there's a demon that's on my property that we feel we might have seen in the house, so it's eventually worked its way in. It's all about the same thing. It's all about understanding that demons want to take your focus off of God, because if your focus is on God, they are powerless. That's their goal. Their desire is to take you out of the hand of God and kill, steal, and destroy. That's what it says in John 10:10. Their job is to kill, steal, and destroy. And that's where, when you sense that, you understand that it's a demonic attack. So when you are in a depression that you can't get out of, yes, go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and get on some medications. I don't oppose any of that. But what are you doing on the spiritual side? Because you might find that the spiritual intervention might make more progress than the others. And eventually you may not need the more physical medical interactions, because I can guarantee you, whether you have biological, clinical diagnosed depression, the demon is using that, if not the cause of that to begin with. You always want to address the spiritual side. So I hope and pray none of the listeners of the Deliverance Project podcast ever meet a black-eyed child. If you do, definitely get a hold of us. We would love to hear that story. And more importantly, exponentially more importantly, we want to pray for you. So I want to thank everybody who tunes into these bonus episodes. I appreciate your support. It helps us to keep this podcast on the air. Again, if you have a story of your own, even if it's not about a BEK, reach out to us at the Deliverance Project Podcast at gmail.com. And we'd love to hear that story as well. I want to just ask that you continue to support both podcasts. Check out the book if you're into that kind of stuff. We'd love to have you check that out. And you can always find us, all that we do, on the struggleseries.com. That website will tell you all about us. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and may God bless you and bring you peace. Take care.
Thank you for listening to The Deliverance Project. Make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you next time.